Welcome to the Stellar Vault. Say hi in the comments to awaken the archive. Then like, subscribe, and let the tale begin.
A warning for the listeners. This story was written before it happened. We are the Eternal Vault. Everything that has ever happened, and everything that ever will, is already inscribed here. Past, present, future. All sit together in our archives. Most stories arrive after they are lived. This one was etched the instant the first Color Dreams glasses shipped. We only waited for the telling. The first kid who put on the glasses just sat there, cross-legged on a living room floor in Manchester, 5 years old, mouth slightly open, eyes tracking the colors. His mother filmed it. 30 seconds of a perfectly still child bathed in soft, shifting light from the cheap plastic lenses. She posted it with the caption, "Finally, peace and quiet." 14 million views in 2 days. Color Dreams hit shelves in March 2046. $43. Plastic frames, lightweight prismatic lenses, marketed as the world's first imagination toy. The pitch was simple. Put them on, see colors. Not a screen, not a game. Just shifting hues that moved and merged and formed shapes that seemed to dance at the edge of perception. Every child saw something different. Some described animals. Some described castles. Some just giggled and pointed at nothing. Parents loved them. Teachers loved them. Pediatricians called them a healthy alternative to screen addiction. Sales hit 9 million units in the first quarter. By summer, every schoolyard in Europe and North America had kids sitting in clusters, glasses on, faces tilted upward, whispering to each other about the colors. Nobody asked why they were so quiet. Nobody asked what they were actually seeing. The hack came 7 months later from a 16-year-old in Seoul named Park Jun-seo, a nobody. Bedroom coder. He cracked the lens frequency pattern in an afternoon, live-streamed the mod, and discovered that if you layered the prismatic output through a standard phone camera, you could record what the glasses revealed. Sort of. The footage was garbage. Smeared light, streaks of impossible color, shapes that almost resolved into something recognizable before dissolving. But one clip caught fire. 11 seconds of what looked like 2 massive luminous figures clashing in a storm of violet and gold, filmed through modified Color Dreams glasses aimed at an empty parking lot in Incheon. The internet called it the Angel Fight. It hit 1 billion views in 72 hours. The manufacturer, Prismacorp, a mid-tier London optics firm that had stumbled into the toy market almost by accident, saw the numbers and did what any company would do. They rushed out the Teen Prism Edition, stronger lenses, wider spectrum, built-in recording capability, marketed to ages 13 and up, priced at $89, celebrity endorsements, influencer campaigns, a Super Bowl ad showing teenagers wearing the glasses at concerts, at beaches, at rooftops, filming the sky and laughing as colors exploded around them. 3 billion units sold worldwide by 2048. 3 billion human minds, mostly young, mostly unguarded, mostly radiating the purest forms of attention and emotion the species could produce, all broadcasting like signal flares into something that was not empty space. Something heard them. Something came. The monks at Wat Phra Dhammakaya in Thailand were the first to say it plainly. A senior abbot, 83 years old, 40 years in meditation, walked out of his quarters one morning in June 2049 and told his students that the war in the unseen realm had changed, that new armies had arrived, that the colors were feeding them. A Shaivite sadhu in Varanasi said the same thing 2 weeks later. Then a Carmelite nun in Andalusia. Then a Zen Roshi in Kyoto. Then 12 separate Sufi mystics across 3 countries, none of whom had any contact with each other, all reporting the same vision. 2 vast luminous forces, one elegant and embodied, the other formless and raging, locked in a war that had suddenly anchored itself to the human world. CNN ran a segment, Mass Hysteria or Mass Perception? The panel included a neuroscientist, a professional skeptic, and a Buddhist teacher who tried to explain vibrational frequency theory in 90 seconds and was cut off for a commercial break. The mystics were ignored. The disasters were not. It started small. Electrical grid failures that didn't match any known cause, weather patterns that defied every model, a fishing village in Norway where the northern lights appeared at noon in July, so bright they burned retinal afterimages into anyone who looked up. A highway in Brazil where 37 cars stopped simultaneously, engines dead, electronics fried, and every driver reported seeing something huge and bright crossing the road. Then it got worse. Earthquakes in regions with no fault lines. Tsunamis spawned from calm seas. Wildfires that burned in colors no one had ever seen. Azure, violet, gold, and left behind glass-smooth craters instead of ash. And always, the correlation that no government wanted to acknowledge. The disasters tracked glass usage. Cities with the highest color dreams adoption rates suffered the most. Seoul, London, Los Angeles, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. The map's overlay was damning. Sales data against disaster frequency. A perfect match. London, October 14th, 2056. The Royal Institution on Albemarle Street had hosted scientific presentations for over 200 years. Faraday lectured here. So did Bragg. The theater seated just under 400, and on this particular Tuesday morning, every seat was filled. Standing room packed. Camera crews from 14 countries crammed into the aisles. Because Dr. Isaac Einstein Grundenwald, and yes, that was his actual legal name, because his parents greatly admired those scientists, had promised to show the world something it was not ready to see. Grundenwald was 59 years old and looked every day of it. Tall, gaunt, white hair that hadn't seen a comb in recent memory, hands that trembled slightly from decades of lab work and too much coffee. His wife had left him in 2051. The divorce papers had sat on his living room table for 3 months before he noticed them. His doctoral students called him the old man, and meant it with equal parts reverence and concern. He wore a rumpled gray suit and no tie. He had not slept in 31 hours. He did not care. The device behind him on the stage looked like a projector mated with a medical scanner, a squat cylindrical housing, trailing cables into a rack of processors, topped with a crystal array that caught the stage lights and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. He had spent 11 years building it. 7 universities had refused to fund the work. A handful of private patrons had quietly stepped in instead, trusting a brilliance the institutions had dismissed. 3 governments had classified his early papers. The prismal neural, the world's first device capable of separating human cerebral wave output by color frequency and translating the result into visible light. In plain language, it would let adults see what children had been seeing for a decade. The science was elegant and brutal. Grundenwald's research had proven what the mystics had claimed, and the skeptics had mocked. Human perception was gated by neurochemistry. Children saw the colors naturally because their neural architecture was open, low cortisol, high neuroplasticity, minimal stress response filtering. Teenagers saw them because pubescent brains still retained enough perceptual flexibility. But adults, flooded with cortisol from jobs and mortgages and news cycles and the grinding baseline anxiety of modern existence, were neurochemically locked out. Their brains filtered the signals as noise. The prismal. Neural bypassed the filter. Grundenwald stepped to the microphone. The room fell silent. 10 years ago, he said, we gave our children a toy. We did not understand what it was. We still don't. Fully. But today, I will show you what they have been seeing." He activated the device. A low hum filled the theater. The crystal array began to rotate, throwing wider and wider arcs of prismatic light across the walls. The audience shifted. Some leaned forward. Some gripped their armrests. The light intensified, separated, began to resolve into distinct bands of color that seemed to vibrate at different speeds. Then the boy came in. His name was Elias Kane. He was 4 years old. It was his birthday. His mother, Dr. Catherine Kane, was a materials physicist, seated in the 7th row. She had been part of Grundenwald's peripheral research network for 2 years. She had tried to find a sitter. She had tried to find anyone. But her husband, Elias's father, had been killed in a car crash 6 months earlier. And on this day, this specific day, she could not bear the thought of her son spending his birthday with a stranger while she sat in an auditorium. So she brought him, left him with a babysitter in the lobby with juice and coloring books and strict instructions. She planned to spend the rest of the day with him afterward and take him to his favorite ice cream place. Elias did not want juice. Elias did not want coloring books. Elias wanted his mum. He slipped away from his nanny. 4-year-olds are faster than doctoral candidates when motivated by rage and grief, and pushed through a fire door into the back of the auditorium. He was wearing his Color Dreams glasses, the kid version, bright blue frames, scuffed from months of daily use. He was crying, not loud, heaving sobs, the quiet kind, the kind that 4-year-olds cry when they've learned that screaming doesn't bring his mom back. He ran down the center aisle. Dr. Kane saw him, started to rise. Too late. Elias crossed directly through the prismal neural beam, and the world changed. Later, Grundenwald would theorize that the boy's emotional state, raw, unfiltered grief layered with anger, layered with the desperate need for his mother, had acted as a living amplifier. The Color Dreams glasses were already tuned to the dimensional frequency. The prismal neural beam was already separating cerebral wave output into visible spectrum bands. When Elias ran through both fields simultaneously, his emotions didn't just amplify the signal. They completed the circuit. Every adult in the theater saw it. The ceiling vanished. The walls dissolved. The auditorium was still there. Chairs, people, stage lights. But layered over it, occupying the same space like a double exposure made of light and fury, was the war. The Voldern came first, towering, luminous, bodies like cathedral spires made of flowing silver and gold, faces that weren't faces, but shifting geometric patterns of impossible beauty, moving with a grace that made human motion look like cave paintings. They fought in formations, precise, elegant, each movement trailing arcs of light that cut through the air like living blades. The Zor hit like a hurricane. No form, no structure, just screaming masses of color and light, red and black and bruise purple, that slammed into the Voldern lines with the subtlety of a freight train. They didn't fight with strategy. They fought with rage. Pure, formless, annihilating rage that warped the air and cracked reality at the edges. Where a Zor mass struck a Voldern warrior, the collision produced sounds that weren't sounds, frequencies that vibrated in the chest, in the teeth, in the marrow. The audience screamed. 14 people fainted. 3 suffered cardiac events. A camera operator dropped his equipment and ran for the doors, knocking over 2 journalists and a security guard. Dr. Catherine Kane threw herself over her son, pressing his face into her coat. But Elias wasn't screaming. He was staring through the gap between her arms, watching the war he had always known was there, because he had seen it every day since he first put on the glasses. Grundenwald stood at the center of the stage, bathed in the light of an alien war that had raged for eons, and understood 3 things simultaneously. 1. The mystics had been right. 2. Humanity had not discovered this war. Humanity had invited it. 3. There was no way to uninvite it. The presentation lasted another 47 seconds before it ran out of power. Emergency services arrived in 9 minutes. The footage, captured by every camera and phone in the room, was classified within the hour by MI5. It was on the internet in 4. The boy was rushed to a hospital, examined, released, physically unharmed. They called him the Catalyst. He would carry that name for the rest of his life. And the world that woke up the next morning was not the world that had gone to sleep. The footage killed the old world in a week. All governments on Earth attempted suppression. Every intelligence agency scrambled to classify, contain, control. It didn't matter. The video from the Royal Institution was everywhere, mirrored across 10,000 servers, translated into 90 languages, analyzed frame by millions of people who watched luminous giants and screaming color storms tear into each other in the skies above a London auditorium, and understood, with the gut-level certainty that no official denial could touch, that reality was not what they had been told. The first wave was denial. Leaders spoke of sophisticated holographic manipulation. Experts appeared on panels to explain mass psychogenic illness. Prismacorp's stock dropped 40% in a day, then surged 300% the next, when a teenage girl in Jakarta live-streamed a teen prism session from her rooftop and captured 11 minutes of Voldern warriors in formation over the city, their silver-gold bodies stretching half a mile into the sky. The second wave was worship. The Voldern were beautiful. There was no other word. The name had come from the children. Across 6 continents, interviewed separately, they used the same sound for the tall, luminous figures in the colors. No linguist could explain it. The word simply appeared in their descriptions and spread from there. They moved like mathematics given flesh, like every cathedral and symphony humanity had ever produced, distilled into living form. Within months, the Church of Prismal Light had 17 million members across 40 countries. They wore white. They meditated on Voldern imagery. They claimed the luminous beings were angels, guardians, proof of divine architecture. They were wrong, but they were sincere, and sincerity spreads faster than truth. The third wave was the Zur cults. Because there were people, there are always people, who looked at the formless, screaming chaos of the Zur and saw not horror, but liberation. The name came from the internet. Someone slowed the original angel fight footage and isolated the sound that the storms of color seemed to produce, a low, grinding vibration that microphones barely captured. When played back, it sounded like a single word. Zur. The label spread in hours. The Zur represented freedom from structure, freedom from order, freedom from the tyranny of beauty and logic, and everything the Voldern stood for. The Zur cults didn't wear white. They didn't meditate. They rioted. They burned Voldern temples. They wore modified Color Dreams glasses around the clock, feeding the signal deliberately, ecstatically, convinced that the Zur's rage was the universe's true voice and that humanity's purpose was to amplify it. The world split down the middle. Families fractured. Governments collapsed. The United Nations held an emergency session that devolved into a fistfight between the Brazilian and Egyptian delegations when footage leaked that Brazil's president had been attending Zur cult ceremonies in private. And the disasters kept coming. It took 14 months after Grundenwald's presentation for California to begin to sink. The San Andreas fault had nothing to do with it. Seismologists confirmed the geology was stable, which made it worse, because the ground was opening anyway. Fissures appeared in February 2058. By June, the Pacific was pouring into the Central Valley through cracks that glowed faint violet at their edges. Los Angeles lost its eastern suburbs first, then Long Beach, then the ports. 6 million people evacuated in the largest displacement in American history. By August 2059, everything west of the Sierra Nevada was gone. Not submerged, dissolved. The land itself had lost coherence, as if the dimensional war overhead had softened the boundary between solid matter and whatever the Zor were made of. They called it the sinking. 14 million displaced, 200,000 dead. New York came next. The blizzard started on January 3rd, 2062. Meteorologists predicted 3 inches. They got 45 days of continuous snowfall at temperatures that bottomed out at negative 67 Fahrenheit. Nothing in the historical record explained it. Nothing in climate science could model it. The snow wasn't white. It carried a faint blue-silver luminescence that prismal neural readings confirmed as Voldern energy residue, as if the elegant being's war maneuvers were shedding cold the way a grinding wheel sheds sparks. Manhattan became a glacier. The Hudson froze solid to a depth of 90 feet. JFK Airport vanished under a drift that satellite imaging measured at 212 feet. The evacuation killed more people than the cold itself. Bridges collapsed under ice load. Tunnels flooded when meltwater from the edges refroze and burst pipes that fed backup generators that powered pumps that kept the Lincoln Tunnel from becoming a mass grave. It became one anyway. They called New York Second Antarctica. The name stuck. The ice never melted. A whole city, forever frozen. 43% of the global economy collapsed between 2061 and 2070. Not from the disasters directly, from the fear, from the paralysis, from the billions of people who had now seen, through color dreams or teen prism, or the prismal neural broadcast feeds that every nation eventually deployed, the 2 alien armies fighting an eternal war that used human attention as fuel and human cities as collateral damage. Still, people kept wearing the glasses. That was the part that drove scientists insane. That was the part that made governments issue bans that nobody enforced and burn stockpiles that were rebuilt overnight. Because the glasses were addictive. Not chemically, not through any mechanism anyone could isolate, but through something more fundamental. The colors were beautiful. The war was terrifying and gorgeous and impossible to look away from. Children who had grown up watching it couldn't stop. Teenagers who had built their identities around it wouldn't stop. Adults who had finally seen the truth couldn't bear to go back to the gray. Humanity was feeding its own destruction and calling it enlightenment. By 2075, the global death toll from dimensional bleed events, the clinical name for disasters caused by the Voldern-Zor War intersecting with physical reality, exceeded 90 million. Coastal cities worldwide reported color tides, surges of chromatic energy that rolled in like fog and left behind warped architecture, mutated vegetation, and people who stared at nothing for days, whispering in languages that linguists confirmed were not human in origin. The world was dying in color, and one man had spent 20 years building the only door that might lead to a cure. Dr. Isaac Einstein Grundenwald was 79 years old in 2076. He moved slowly. His hands shook worse than ever. His left knee had been replaced twice. He wore the same style of rumpled gray suit he had worn at the Royal Institution presentation 20 years earlier, though this one was newer because the original had been archived by the British Museum as a historical artifact, which he found absurd. The stable dimensional gate he created occupied a converted aircraft hangar at a military installation in Cornwall that officially didn't exist. The device was ugly, a 12-meter ring of superconducting alloy wrapped in crystal arrays that hummed at frequencies which gave everyone within 200 meters a persistent headache. It had taken 11 years to build, 6 to stabilize, and had killed 2 technicians during testing when a calibration error opened a micro rift that flooded the chamber with Zor energy and stopped their hearts. Grundenwald had attended both funerals. He did not give speeches. He went back to work. The gate could open a stable passage into the dimensional space where the Voldern and Zor waged their war. Stable, meaning it would hold for approximately 90 seconds before the energy cost exceeded the output of the 3 dedicated nuclear reactors feeding it. 90 seconds to send a team through. Then it closed, permanently. The reactors would be spent. The crystal arrays would shatter. There was no second attempt. And there was no return trip. Grundenwald had published the mathematics, peer-reviewed, confirmed by every major physics institution, still functioning. The gate worked in one direction. The energy required to open a passage from inside the dimensional space back to Earth exceeded the total output of human civilization by a factor of 11,000. Anyone who went through was not coming back. He needed volunteers willing to die. He found them. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Jackson arrived first, 38 years old, 16 years in the United States Marine Corps, 3 combat tours, a chest full of medals he kept in a shoebox under his bunk because wearing them felt like advertising. Born in Baltimore, raised by a grandmother who told him every Sunday that God had built him like a fortress for a reason. He stood 6'3", 220 pounds, and spoke with a calm so deep it unnerved people who didn't know him and anchored people who did. His call sign was Hammer, not because he hit hard, though he did, because he only ever hit once. Sergeant Kenji Takahashi came next, 34, born in Honolulu, raised in silence by a father who communicated primarily through the maintenance of a small garden and the expectation that his son would figure out what mattered without being told. Takahashi had figured it out. What mattered was precision. He was the finest sniper in the Marine Corps and had never once discussed a confirmed kill. His call sign was Ghost. He had earned it by being the kind of man you forgot was in the room until someone needed to die quietly. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, 36. Parents emigrated from Volgograd when he was 3. Grew up in a meatpacking district in Chicago, where the cold and the smell and the casual violence had built something in him that drill instructors recognized immediately and knew better than to try to tame. He carried a heavy weapons specialty and a disposition that sat somewhere between professional soldier and grizzly bear that had learned to fill out paperwork. His call sign was Bear. Nobody argued with it. Sergeant Tyler Harlan, born in a town in West Virginia small enough that he described it as 40 people and a gas station, and the gas station left. Demolitions expert. He could build a shaped charge from hardware store supplies and a mean disposition, which he had in abundance. Sarcastic, fast-talking, the kind of man who cracked jokes while setting timers because the alternative was thinking about what happened when the timer hit 0. Call sign, Rook. He played chess badly, but thought 17 moves ahead with explosives. Corporal Jamal Washington, 35, from Detroit. Close-quarters combat specialist who had once cleared a 4-room compound with a rifle, a combat knife, and a broken chair leg, not because he'd run out of ammunition, but because the chair leg had been closer. Quick hands, quicker instincts, and an ability to improvise weapons from whatever was within arm's reach that his instructors had stopped trying to train into a system and simply listed as adaptive lethality on his evaluations. Call sign, Shade. He worked best when you couldn't see him coming. Sergeant Maria Rainwater, mid-30s, the only woman on the team, and the only one Grundenwald had recruited personally rather than through military channels. Combat medic, U.S. Navy, attached to Marine units for 6 years. But her file only told half the story. Born on the Navajo Nation, raised between 2 worlds, one that taught her battlefield surgery and triage protocols, another that taught her things the military had no form for. She carried a medical kit and a medicine bag. She could set a compound fracture and sing a healing chant over it in the same breath. The Marines called her Doc Rain. Dr. Silver Moore, 30 years old, British, Grundenwald's assistant, intellectual heir, and the reason the old man's research had never starved for funding. Moore was the sole heir to the Moore-Ashworth pharmaceutical fortune, a family whose name sat on buildings at 3 universities and a wing of the British Museum. He had been 20 when he walked into Grundenwald's lab at Cambridge, wrote a dimensional frequency equation on a whiteboard that made the old man stop mid-sentence, and said, "I want in." He brought his mind first and his money second, but both were extraordinary. Within a year, he had redirected the bulk of his personal trust into Grundenwald's research. He had spent a decade learning everything the old man knew. He was not a soldier. He was thin, pale from years of lab work, and had never fired a weapon. His weapon was his mind, and Grundenwald had sharpened it into something that could cut through the laws of physics. And then there was the catalyst. Corporal Elias Kane, 24 years old, British, Royal Marine, the boy from the auditorium. He had grown up inside the catastrophe he'd triggered. Every documentary, every news cycle, each Voldern cult procession, and Zor riot, and dimensional bleed disaster. He had lived through all of it, knowing that he was the one who had completed the circuit, the boy who tore the veil, the 4-year-old in blue-framed glasses who had run crying for his mother and accidentally shown humanity the war that was eating it alive. He didn't talk about it. He had enlisted at 18, passed selection for the Royal Marines at 19, and spent 6 years becoming the kind of soldier who volunteered for missions that didn't have return tickets. Not because he wanted to die, because he owed a debt that could only be paid in one direction. Grundenwald didn't recruit him. Kane had found Grundenwald. "I started this," he said, standing in the old man's office in Cornwall, 20 years after a birthday that had broken the world. Grundenwald had studied him for a long time, then nodded. "Then you'll finish it." The gate opened at 6 o'clock on March 7th, 2078. The hangar shook. The crystal arrays screamed, a sound like glass singing in a hurricane, rising in pitch until it left the range of human hearing and became a pressure in the skull. The 12-meter ring blazed white, then fractured into every color that existed and several that didn't. The air inside the ring didn't shimmer. It broke. Like a window hit with a hammer, reality cracked in concentric circles outward from the center, and through the cracks poured light and sound. Grundenwald stood at the front, Moore beside him, Kane behind them both. The Marines in a line, Jackson at the center, Volkov on his left, already breathing hard through his nose the way he did before contact. Takahashi on the right, still, eyes fixed on the gate, measuring. Harlan checking his charges one last time. Washington rolling his shoulders. Doc Rain with one hand on her medical kit, and the other touching something beneath her vest that was not military issue. 90 seconds. Grundenwald looked at the gate, looked at the team. "No long speeches," he said. "You know what we're doing. You know we're not coming back. Walk through that door and end this war." Jackson racked his rifle. The sound cut through the noise like a knife through silk. "Let's go fuck around and find out." Kane stepped forward, past Grundenwald, past Moore, first to the edge. He stopped, turned back, not to the team, to the gate technicians, to the military observers, to the cameras that were recording this for a world that would never understand what it cost. "This ends," he said. He walked through. Jackson followed, then Volkov, then Takahashi, Harlan, Washington, Doc Rain. Moore took Grundenwald's arm. The old man's knee was bad, his balance worse, and they stepped through together. The gate closed 11 seconds later. The crystal arrays shattered. The reactors went dark. The hangar fell silent. 9 people had walked into a war that had raged since before humanity learned to speak. None of them were coming back. The other side was not a place. That was the first thing Grundenwald said after they pulled him off the ground. A place has rules. Ground stays down. Light comes from somewhere. Sound travels in directions you can predict. What they had stepped into followed none of that. The ground was a shifting plane of compacted color, dense, semi-solid, crunching underfoot like frozen sand, that tilted without warning, sometimes gently, sometimes hard enough to throw a man sideways. The sky, if you could call it a sky, was a roiling canopy of light that pulsed and shifted between violets and golds and colors that didn't have names in any human language. There was no sun. There was no horizon. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, casting shadows that pointed in different directions depending on which second you looked. Sound was worse. Every noise arrived late or early or layered on top of itself so that a single footstep produced a cascade of echoes that hadn't happened yet. Volkov shouted something and heard his own voice come back to him 3 times, each version slightly different, as if the realm was workshopping variations. Gravity held. Mostly. It flickered twice in the first 10 minutes. Brief lurches where down became sideways for half a second, and the squad grabbed at each other like drunks on a ship deck. Harlan vomited during the second one. Takahashi didn't. Takahashi never did anything that wasn't deliberate. Kane was the first to recover full orientation. He'd been seeing this place since he was 4 years old. Not clearly. The Color Dream's glasses had shown him fragments, impressions, the smeared edges of a reality his child brain couldn't fully process. But his nervous system recognized it. The way a man who dreamed of a house his whole life might walk through its front door and know where the stairs were. 12 o'clock, he said. Quiet. Flat. Pointing into the swirling color field ahead. Jackson looked. Saw nothing. Raised his rifle optics. Still nothing. I don't see a damn thing, Kane. You will. 30 seconds later, Jackson saw it. A ripple in the color field. A distortion, like heat haze, except it was moving toward them with purpose. Then another. Then 6 more. Shapes forming out of the chromatic noise. Long, angular, luminous. Voldern scouts. Contact front, Jackson said. Same comm he'd carry into a hurricane. Weapons free. The first shots of the war sounded wrong. Rifles cracked and the sound bent, stretched, folded back. Tracers left trails that curved in directions bullets shouldn't curve. Takahashi fired 3 rounds. 2 struck. The Voldern scout shattered like a stained glass window hit with a sledgehammer. Fragments of light spinning outward, dissolving before they hit the ground. It was beautiful. It was horrible. Volkov opened up with the heavy gun. The sound was enormous, a rolling thunder that the realm's broken acoustics multiplied into something almost geological. 2 more Voldern came apart. The rest scattered, fast, fluid, moving in patterns that didn't track with human combat spacing. They're not attacking, Moore said. He was on one knee behind Jackson, breathing hard, watching with the intensity of a man taking notes inside a burning building. They're assessing, Grundenwald finished. The old man was leaning on a piece of wreckage that hadn't been there 10 seconds ago. The realm generated structures the way a wound generates scab tissue, pushing up jagged formations of crystallized color that were solid enough to use as cover. They've never seen us before. They're trying to decide what we are. Let them decide we're dangerous, Jackson said. Volkov, suppressive fire on the left. Ghost, anything that gets within 300, drop it. Everyone else, we move forward. Find hard cover. Establish a perimeter. They moved. 9 humans in an alien war zone, pushing through a landscape that reacted to their presence like skin reacting to a splinter. The ground shifting, hardening, pushing up barriers and obstacles that might have been defensive or might have been the realm's immune response. Nobody knew. There was no manual for this. They found cover 200 meters forward, a ridge of fused crystal formations, waist-high, dense enough to stop Voldern energy bolts, and solid enough to brace a weapon against. Behind it, they built their first camp. Grundenwald immediately began taking readings with instruments he'd carried in a reinforced case strapped to his chest. Moore assisted, recording data while the Marines established a perimeter and Doc Rain checked everyone for injuries. "Time," Grundenwald said. He was staring at his instruments with the expression of a man watching a car crash in slow motion. "Silver, look at this." Moore looked. His face went white. The readings confirmed what Grundenwald had theorized and feared. Time inside the dimensional space moved at a radically different rate than time on Earth. His instruments, synced to an atomic clock back in Cornwall before the gate closed, showed that in the 47 minutes they had been inside the realm, approximately 16 seconds had passed on Earth. 1 Earth year would equal over 100 years inside. They were not on a mission. They were inside a sentence, a life sentence. Grundenwald sat down on a slab of crystal and pulled out his notebook, already writing. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose I should work faster." The first subjective year inside the realm established the pattern that would define their existence. The squad secured a forward position, a jagged cluster of crystal formations that Harlan rigged with explosive tripwires, and Volkov reinforced with salvaged Voldern wreckage that was harder than anything human metallurgy had ever produced. They called it the Bastion. It was ugly, functional, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Grundenwald spent every waking hour at his instruments, mapping the dimensional space, cataloging energy signatures, building a theoretical framework for the Voldern-Zur War that grew more complete and more horrifying with every data point. Moore was at his side constantly, recording, calculating, challenging, absorbing. The old man taught, and the young man learned, and in the spaces between lessons, they built weapons. Frequency grenades came first. Grundenwald's research into cerebral wave separation had given him the theoretical foundation. If human perception operated on color frequencies, and the alien beings were composed of color frequencies, then a device that could disrupt those frequencies at the point of cohesion would function as a weapon. Moore did the engineering. Harlan did the casing. The first prototype was a canister the size of a coffee thermos, packed with crystal shards and a modified detonator. Volkov threw it at a Zur mass that had been probing the Bastion's perimeter for 3 days. The detonation was silent. A pulse of anti-color, the only way to describe it, expanded outward in a sphere. Where it touched the Zur mass, the formless rage entity simply stopped existing. Not destroyed, unraveled. Its constituent frequencies scattered into noise and didn't reform. Volkov stared at the empty space where a building-sized alien entity had been screaming 30 seconds ago. "I want 20 of those," he said. They built 30. But the realm fought back. The Voldern adapted within weeks, tightening their energy coherence, shifting frequency bands, learning to sense the grenades before detonation, and dispersing before the pulse hit. The Zur adapted slower, but more brutally. They began merging, fusing smaller entities into massive amalgamations that could absorb a frequency grenade's pulse and keep coming, diminished, but alive and angrier. The time dilation hit the oldest first. Grundenwald had entered at 81. Within the first subjective decade inside the realm, he looked 100 years old. Within the second, he looked like something that should have been buried years ago. His body failed in stages. Joints first, then vision, then the tremors that had been manageable for decades became convulsions that left him unable to hold a pen. Moore built him braces from alien crystal. Doc Rain mixed medications from their dwindling supplies, and from compounds she extracted from the realm's strange organic growths, mosses and fungi that grew in the crevices of crystal formations and had properties she catalogued with the methodical precision of a woman building a pharmacy from scratch. She sang over him sometimes, not English, not Navajo exactly, something older, learned from her ancestors. The Marines pretended not to hear. They heard. Grundenwald kept working. Moore wrote what the old man's hands could no longer write, took dictation, ran calculations that Grundenwald directed from a chair made of fused crystal and salvaged alien alloy, wrapped in thermal blankets that Doc Rain stitched from whatever they could find. Grundenwald was dying. His body was done. His mind was not. Silver. Moore was at his side. Always at his side those last months. The others gave them space. Even Jackson, who gave nobody space, who stayed close to every member of his squad at all times because that was what leaders did. Even Jackson backed off. This was between the old man and the young one. All the equations are in the archive. Every frequency map, weapon schematic, and reading I've taken since we came through. You have it all. I know. The Nexus is real. I've confirmed it. Both races feed from a single point, a convergence where their war originated. Destroy it, and you collapse the entire dimensional bridge to Earth. Both races lose their anchor. The war continues here, but it stops touching our world. I know, Professor. Grundenwald reached for Moore's hand. His grip was nothing, a whisper of pressure. Finish it, Silver. Humanity doesn't kneel. He died that night, quietly, breathing slowing until it simply wasn't there anymore. Doc Rain confirmed it. Moore sat with the body for an hour, alone, in the cold blue light of the bastion. Then he stood up, walked to the workstation, and picked up where the old man had left off. They buried Grundenwald in crystal. Harlan shaped the tomb with demolition charges, precise, controlled, the best work he'd ever done. Volkov carried the body. Jackson said a few words. Not a eulogy. Just, he came here knowing he'd die here. He worked every day he had. That's enough. Kane stood apart. He had known the old man long enough to understand what had been lost. The decades ground on. Time inside the realm was not linear. It moved in surges, weeks that felt like months, months that compressed into what felt like days. The squad's internal clocks shattered within the first subjective year and were replaced by something cruder, mission markers. How many Voldern encounters since the last Zur assault? How many frequency grenades remaining? How many times Doc Rain had rebuilt Volkov's left shoulder? They stopped counting Earth time. It didn't matter. Earth was a memory that belonged to people they used to be. The younger team members aged slowly. Grundenwald's final notes had predicted it. The realm's energy field interacted with cellular decay in ways that correlated inversely with biological age at entry. Moore, who had entered at 30, was physically in his 40s after 50 subjective years. They all aged at varying rates, but all slower than any human had a right to expect. It meant they would live long enough to finish the mission. It also meant they would live long enough to suffer. The first Marine died 61 years in. Shade went the way he would have wanted. Close quarters, fast, brutal. A Zur amalgamation breached the bastion's eastern wall during a coordinated assault that hit all four sides simultaneously. Washington was the closest. He grabbed a jagged shard of crystal wreckage in one hand and his combat knife in the other, and threw himself into the breach, buying the 30 seconds Volkov needed to bring the heavy gun around. The Zur mass consumed him. There was no body to recover. The anti-color flames that Doc Rain had developed, another of Moore's innovations, a controlled burn that disrupted Zur cohesion at close range, cleared the breach, but Washington was gone. Dissolved into the same screaming color chaos he'd been fighting for 6 decades. Jackson didn't speak for 3 days. Rook went next. 87 years in, a demolition run on a Voldern forward position that had been launching energy strikes at the bastion for weeks. Harlan rigged the charges, set the timers, and was 40 meters from the detonation point when a Voldern patrol materialized from a frequency band his instruments hadn't detected. He triggered the charges early. The explosion took the Voldern position, the patrol, and Tyler Harlan with it. They found his dog tags in the blast crater. Nothing else. Bear almost died 9 times. Each time, Doc Rain brought him back with a combination of battlefield surgery, alien pharmaceuticals she'd developed from the realm's organic compounds, and rituals the remaining Marines simply accepted by year 40. Volkov's body was more prosthetic than flesh by the century mark, his left arm replaced entirely by a framework of Voldern crystal alloy that Moore had reverse-engineered, his right eye gone and filled with a Zor-derived optical sensor that let him see across frequency bands no human eye could detect. The prosthetics hurt, every second of every day. Volkov didn't complain. He just hit harder. Takahashi never changed. 100 years in and Ghost was Ghost. Silent, precise, lethal. His hair had gone white. His hands were steady as stone. He had stopped counting kills around year 30 and started counting something else, the distance to the Nexus, which Moore updated weekly on a crystal slab mounted to the bastion's central wall. The number went down. Slowly. Too slowly. But it went down. Moore became something else entirely. At 100 years old, he was still sharp, sharper than he'd been at 30, if anything, because a century of data and a mind trained by Grundenwald had turned him into the foremost expert on dimensional physics who would ever exist. He built weapons the way other men built sentences, frequency lances, anti-color flamethrowers, resonance mines that could shatter Voldern formations at half a kilometer. He mapped the realm's geography, identified the energy currents that both races used for travel, and plotted a route to the Nexus that avoided the worst kill zones. Kane fought beside him like a son who had never had a father long enough to learn what that meant and had spent a century figuring it out. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, lost to a Voldern energy blade in year 73. His voice was a rasp from a century of shouting orders through color storms. He carried a rifle modified so heavily with alien components that Grundenwald wouldn't have recognized it, and a combat knife that was the only piece of original Earth equipment any of them still possessed. Doc Rain was the one who held them together, not with medicine, though she did that. Not with her rituals, though she did those too. She held them together by being the one person in the squad who had never lost sight of why they were here. She kept account, scratched into the crystal wall of her quarters at the bastion, of every dimensional bleed event they had prevented by destroying Voldern and Zor forward positions. Every number on that wall was a city that didn't sink, a coast that didn't freeze, a population that kept breathing because 9 people had walked through a gate and refused to stop fighting. 130 years in, and the Nexus was close. Moore stood at the edge of the bastion's highest point, a crystal spire Volkov had carried him to because his legs had stopped working. He looked out across the realm. The horizon, which didn't exist, pulsed with a light that was different from the ambient chaos. Brighter, denser, a knot of energy so massive it warped the color field around it like a drain warps water. The prism nexus. The fused, screaming core of both races. The point where the Voldern and Zor had first collided eons ago and created the eternal war that had reached across dimensions and latched onto a species that had been foolish enough to build a toy that rang like a bell in the dark. "How far?" Kane asked. He was standing behind Moore, always standing behind Moore now, the way Moore had once stood behind Grundenwald. Moore squinted. His eyes were bad. Everything was bad. but his mind could still calculate distance from energy density readings the way other men could judge distance from landmarks. 3 days' march, maybe 4. Can we make it? Moore looked at Jackson, at Volkov, half machine, already checking his ammunition. At Takahashi, white-haired and silent, rifle across his knees. At Doc Rain, hands steady as ever, packing her kit for one last movement. "We'll make it," Moore said. "The mathematics never included a return." Jackson almost smiled. Almost. "All right," he said. "Last movement. Everybody up. We finish this." They moved at the speed of the slowest man, and the slowest man refused to be carried again. Moore held a staff made from a Voldern spinal column across his lap, a 6-foot length of fused crystal alloy that Volkov had ripped from a dead scout commander, and Kane had shaped into something functional with a combat knife and patience. Moore's legs didn't work anymore. The right knee had degraded past anything Doc Rain could repair with the materials they had left. She had offered to build him a brace from Zur composite. He had declined. Zur material was unstable. It hummed. It whispered. Marines could tolerate it in their prosthetics because Marines could tolerate anything. Moore needed silence to think, and he needed to think clearly for what came next. Kane walked point. He was still the first man forward, still the one who read the color field the way other soldiers read terrain. The realm had changed as they moved toward the Nexus. The ambient chaos was thicker here, color pressed against them like humidity, coating their skin, leaving residue that glowed faintly and tasted like copper. The ground had hardened from the usual shifting semi-solid into something denser, darker, veined with threads of gold and silver that pulsed in rhythm. A heartbeat. The Nexus had a heartbeat. Jackson held the center, Volkov on his left, Takahashi on his right, Doc Rain behind Moore. The formation was automatic. 130 years of combat had burned movement patterns into their nervous system so deeply that they could have done this asleep. They had done it asleep during the middle decades, when exhaustion became a permanent state, and the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness was just a matter of whether your eyes were open. The Voldern found them on the second day. Hundreds of the luminous beings formed into a phalanx that blocked the approach to the Nexus like a wall of living light. They were larger this close to the core, 12, 15 feet tall, their geometric faces cycling through patterns so complex they hurt to look at. They didn't attack. They formed up and waited, watching. "They know," Moore said, breathing hard, studying the formation with eyes that saw past the light and into the frequency architecture beneath. "They know why we're here." "Do they know they can't stop us?" Jackson asked. "They think they can. They've been fighting the Zur for longer than our sun has existed. They've never lost a position they chose to hold." Jackson looked at Volkov. Volkov was already grinning. It was not a pleasant grin. It was the grin of a man who had been replacing parts of himself with alien machinery for a century and had long ago stopped caring about the line between courage and insanity. "Bear." "Duh." "Open the door." Volkov unslung the weapon he'd been carrying for the last 80 years. It didn't have a name. It was too ugly for a name. A heavy frame built from salvaged Voldern alloy, firing resonance charges that Moore had designed to shatter energy coherence at the molecular level. It weighed 60 pounds. Volkov handled it like a pistol. He fired into the center of the Voldern phalanx. The round hit like a thunderclap made of silence. A sphere of disruption expanded outward from the impact point. Not an explosion, not a shockwave, but an unraveling. Voldern warriors at the center simply came apart, their luminous bodies dissolving into cascading fragments of light that scattered and dimmed and were gone. The phalanx buckled. The gap was 20 meters wide. "Move," Jackson said. The Voldern closed ranks and pursued. Energy bolts streaked past them, beams of concentrated light that hit the ground and turned crystal formations into molten glass. Takahashi turned, dropped to one knee, and began firing with the mechanical precision of a man who had been killing at distance for longer than most civilizations lasted. Every shot landed. Every shot shattered a Voldern warrior. He didn't rush. He didn't waste. He put rounds into the leading edge of the pursuit and made them pay for every meter they closed. "Ghost, move your ass!" Jackson shouted. Takahashi fired 3 more times, 3 more kills. Then he stood, turned, and ran. The Zor hit from the east, no warning, no formation. Just a screaming wall of formless color fury that tore out of the ambient field like a hurricane peeling off the ocean. The sound alone knocked Doc Rain sideways. Kane caught her, hauled her up, kept moving. The Zor mass slammed into the pursuing Voldern, and the two forces collided with an impact that cracked the ground beneath them and sent shockwaves rippling outward through the color field. "They're fighting each other," Doc Rain said. "Use it," Jackson called. "While they're engaged, push through, double time." They ran, 6 broken, ancient, rebuilt humans, running through a gap between 2 alien armies that were too busy destroying each other to notice the insect slipping between their feet. Moore stumbled twice. Kane caught him both times without slowing. Volkov brought up the rear, firing blind behind him, the heavy weapon's resonance charges punching holes in anything that got close. The Nexus appeared on the horizon like a second sun being born. It was not what any of them had expected. Moore had theorized a structure, a convergence point, an energy node, something with architecture. What they saw was a wound. A screaming, pulsing, living wound in the fabric of everything. A point where the dimensional space itself had been torn open by eons of war and fused into a knot of energy so dense that reality bent around it like light around a black hole. Voldern gold and Zor crimson spiraled into each other at the center, merging and separating and merging again in patterns that were both beautiful and obscene. The sound it made was not a sound. It was a pressure, a weight on the chest, on the skull, on the part of the brain that processes fear. "That's it," Moore said. He was staring at the Nexus with an expression that was part awe and part the cold, analytical hunger of a scientist finally seeing the thing he'd spent a lifetime hunting. The origin point, where they first collided. The entire war radiates from that knot. "This is where we end it?" Jackson asked. "The Nexus is a frequency lock," Moore said. 2 sets of waves perfectly opposed, perfectly balanced, holding each other in eternal stalemate. That's why neither side can win. They're matched. Exactly. Perfectly matched. The war can't end because the equation can't resolve. "So we add a variable," Kane said. Moore looked at him, then nodded. "Exactly. We add the only variable the equation has never seen. Human. Raw human emotional output. Every frequency at once. Rage, grief, love, hate, hope, spite. It's noise to them. Their entire existence is structured around 2 frequencies. We introduce a third. A messy, chaotic, contradictory, impossible third signal. And the lock breaks." "Your device?" Moore had built the device, the core device, the one he'd been carrying in a reinforced case since they left the Bastion, the one that weighed almost nothing because it was made from materials that didn't fully exist in physical space. It amplifies and broadcasts. Everything we feel in the moment of detonation gets pumped directly into the Nexus at power levels that will overwhelm the balance. The knot unravels. Both races lose their anchor point. The dimensional bridge to Earth collapses. How long? "Give me 20 minutes to set the device. Keep them off me." Jackson nodded, turned to what was left of his team: Volkov, Takahashi, Doc Rain, Kane. "You heard the man. 20 minutes. Standard defensive perimeter. Close formation. Everything we've got left." Volkov racked a fresh charge into the heavy weapon. The mechanical arm whined and locked. His remaining eye, the human one, was bright with something that might have been joy. Hammer! Yeah, Bear. It has been an honor to fuck around with you. Jackson put his hand on Volkov's shoulder, held it there for 3 seconds. Find out with me one more time. They formed the line. The Voldern and the Zur came together. For the first time in their eternal war, they stopped fighting each other. The humans at the Nexus were doing something. Both races could feel it. A disruption in the frequency architecture, a foreign signal building in intensity at the exact point where their existence was anchored. They didn't communicate. They didn't negotiate an alliance. They simply recognized, in whatever passed for cognition in beings made of light and fury, that the greater threat was the small cluster of broken creatures setting up a device at the heart of everything. They attacked from all sides. Jackson's firing line held for 11 minutes. Volkov anchored the left. The heavy weapon roared, a sound that had been the last thing thousands of alien entities had heard over the past century. Resonance charges tore through the advancing Voldern formations, shattering warriors into cascading light. But they kept coming. Rank after rank, reforming as fast as he could break them, their geometric bodies cycling through defensive frequency shifts that made each successive shot less effective. Takahashi held the right flank. 1 round, 1 kill. The sniper rifle cracked with metronomic regularity, a rhythm that had kept him sane for all those years and would keep him killing for as long as he had ammunition. He targeted leaders, command nodes, the Voldern, whose frequency patterns were more complex, whose movements suggested tactical authority. Everyone he dropped caused a ripple of confusion in the formations behind it. Not enough, never enough, but enough to buy seconds. Kane and Doc Rain held the center. Kane fought with everything he had, rifle, knife, fists, a jagged shard of crystal he'd picked up when the rifle overheated and jammed. He fought without slowing, the war compressed into every movement. Doc Rain fought beside him, combat knife in one hand, the other hand empty, fingers spread, mouth moving in words that were not English and not Navajo. Where her empty hand pointed, Zur masses hesitated, shuddered, pulled back. Whatever she was doing, it worked. And in the calculus of survival, that was the only metric that mattered. Moore worked. His hands shook. They had been shaking for 50 years. It didn't matter. The device was elegant. Grundenwald's theoretical framework, Moore's engineering, built from materials harvested from both Voldern and Zur. It fit in his palms. It would end everything. The calibration was the hard part. The device needed to broadcast at the exact intersection frequency of both races, the point where gold met crimson and the eternal stalemate held. Too high, and it would only disrupt the Voldern. Too low, and it would only scatter the Zur. The margin of error was 0. Moore's hands shook. His mind did not. 12 minutes. Volkov went down. A Zur mass breached the left flank, a concentrated surge of color fury that hit him like a wall. The heavy weapon flew from his hands. The alien prosthetic arm shattered at the shoulder. Volkov rolled, grabbed a frequency grenade from his belt with his remaining hand, pulled the pin with his teeth, and stuffed it into the center of the Zur mass at point-blank range. The detonation erased everything within 15 meters. Volkov was inside that radius. 14 minutes. Takahashi ran dry. The last round left his rifle, and he set it down carefully, the way he did everything, and drew his sidearm. Smaller caliber, less effective against Voldern energy coherence. He didn't care. He fired until the sidearm was empty. Then he drew his knife. A Voldern warrior, 10 feet tall, luminous, beautiful, closed on him from the right. Takahashi drove the knife into the point where its frequency patterns converged, the kill spot he'd identified in year 12, one nobody else had ever tried to hit, because nobody else was fast enough, and twisted. The warrior shattered, Its death loss sent a pulse that stunned two more behind it. Takahashi stepped into the gap. A second warrior hit him from behind, a beam of concentrated light through the chest. Ghost fell without a sound. Even dying, he didn't make noise. 16 minutes. More! Jackson shouted. He was firing controlled bursts, dropping back toward the device, trying to compress the perimeter around the only man who mattered. 4 minutes! You've got 2. Kane fell back to Moore's position. Doc Rain beside him, Jackson completing the triangle. 3 people and a scientist. Against everything. It's ready, Moore said. His voice was steady. His hands had stopped shaking. Don't forget this. The device broadcasts our emotional output, all of it. Everything we feel in the moment of detonation. Meaning what? Kane asked. Meaning the more intense the emotion, the more powerful the disruption. When I trigger this, don't hold back. Feel everything. Every loss, every year, every friend we buried in this place. Let it out. All of it. Jackson's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it. Drew his sidearm. Doc, anything left in the kit? Doc Rain looked at him. Her face was bloody. Her medical kit was gone, lost somewhere in the last 5 minutes. The medicine bag was still at her chest. She touched it. One last thing, she said, but it's not from the kit. She began to sing. It was the same song she had sung over Grundenwald when he was dying, the same song she had hummed in the dark corners of the Bastion when the losses piled up and the mission felt like a sentence with no punctuation. But now she sang it at full voice, and the sound carried across the battlefield in a way sound hadn't carried properly since they arrived. The realm's broken acoustics didn't touch it. The song moved through the color field like a knife through water. Clean, clear, undistorted. The Voldern hesitated. The Zur pulled back. For 3 seconds, the eternal war paused because something was happening at its center that neither race had encountered in all their eons of existence. A human woman was singing a song that predated every civilization on Earth, and the sound was doing something to the frequency architecture that their entire reality was built on. Now, Silver, Kane said. Moore activated the device. The pulse was invisible. It had no color, no light, no sound. It was pure human frequency, unfiltered, unstructured, chaotic, pumped directly into the nexus at an amplitude that the dimensional space had never been designed to process. And everything they felt went with it. Kane shouted, and the sound carried, striking the nexus like a blow. Jackson's calm broke for the first and only time. The weight of every Marine he'd lost released in a single breath that the device caught and broadcast at frequencies that cracked the foundations of the war. Doc Rain's song rose until it was no longer music, but something sharper, older, moving through the color field untouched. The Nexus screamed. Moore felt Grundenwald's presence at his shoulder, not real, not possible, and heard the old man's voice in his mind. Humanity doesn't kneel. The knot, the fused, eternal, unbreakable knot of Voldern gold and Zur crimson, shuddered. The two frequencies that had been locked in perfect opposition for longer than Earth had existed were suddenly drowning in noise, human noise, messy, contradictory, impossible noise, rage and love and grief and spite and hope and despair and stubbornness and the desperate, irrational, magnificent refusal to accept that anything was eternal. The lock broke. The nexus erupted in a light that was not light, a sound that was not sound. The dimensional space around them cracked, not the small fractures they'd been living with for a century, but deep structural failures that propagated outward from the core at the speed of something faster than light. The Voldern formations shattered. The Zur masses dissolved. Both races, for the first time in their existence, experienced the thing they had inflicted on each other for eons, an ending. Kane was on his knees. The light was taking him apart, Not painfully, not violently, but completely. He could feel his body losing coherence, his cells unraveling the way the Voldern warriors had unraveled under frequency grenade fire. He looked at Moore. The old scientist was sitting on the ground, the device still in his hands, his eyes closed, his face peaceful in a way Kane had never seen Bavor. Silver. Moore opened his eyes, smiled. "We finished it, Eli." The light took them. Jackson died on his feet. Rifle gone, sidearm gone, standing in the middle of an apocalypse with his fists clenched and his jaw set, and the same unbreakable calm he had carried from Baltimore to Cornwall, to a dimension that shouldn't exist. He had come here to protect his people. He had done it. He was done. Doc Rain died singing. The song didn't stop when her body failed. It echoed through the collapsing dimensional space for a long time after, as if the realm itself had learned the melody and didn't know how to forget it. Epilogue. Earth. March 8th, 2079, 1 year and 1 day after the gate opened. The disasters stopped. Not gradually. Not in a slow decline that scientists could chart and politicians could take credit for. They stopped. Overnight. Completely. The color tides that had been rolling through coastal cities vanished between one tide cycle and the next. The electromagnetic anomalies that had plagued power grids for 2 decades went silent. The fault lines that had been rupturing in geologically impossible patterns stabilized. New York thawed. It took 2 months. The ice that had entombed Manhattan for all those years didn't melt. It sublimated, transitioning directly from solid to vapor in a process that left the city wet, damaged, but standing. Engineers who had written off every structure below 110th Street were stunned to find buildings intact beneath the ice. Not untouched, warped, stressed, scarred, but standing. The city had survived. It would take years to rebuild, but it would rebuild. The glasses became forbidden relics. Every government on Earth passed legislation simultaneously, the first and only time in human history that every nation agreed on anything. Color Dreams, Teen Prism, and every variant and knockoff were classified as existential threat materials. Possession carried penalties ranging from fines to imprisonment. Prismacorp was dissolved, its patents were sealed, its manufacturing facilities were demolished. Children who had grown up wearing the glasses reported that the colors were gone. The war was gone. The shifting shapes and luminous beings and screaming color storms that had been visible to young eyes for over 30 years had simply ceased to exist, as if someone had switched off a projector in a theater nobody could find. The mystics confirmed it. The unseen realm was quiet. The war had moved on, or ended, or collapsed into something that no longer touched the human world. Nobody knew why. The gate facility in Cornwall remained classified. The records of the 9 volunteers who had walked through a one-way door on March 7th, 2078, were sealed at the highest level of every intelligence agency that knew they existed. The project itself had never been secret. Private funding, private research. But the moment Moore vanished inside the Nexus, the authorities buried it anyway. Everyone present that day was removed from public life and issued new identities. 9 people had ended an alien war that nearly destroyed Earth, and humanity went about its business of rebuilding without ever knowing the price. No graves, no bodies, no evidence that any of it had happened, except the scars on a planet that was slowly, painfully, beginning to heal. The world moved on. It always does. But the Stellar Vault remembers.